This is Sandra Farid here. I am your MC for today, for the Finance Day. Our next panel is a very interesting one, talking about the role of platforms. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Serene Hawaii, Group Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC Group. I will let her introduce the panelists. Again, the title of the panel is Trillion to Transition, Harnessing the Potential of SDG Aligned Investment in Emerging Markets. Here you go, the mic is yours.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel. As the header shows, our focus is really on going from the millions to the trillions today. We really want to go deep on how to unlock the obstacles. We know nowhere near the amount of the need is flowing at the moment, especially so to emerging and developing markets. With me today, I've got His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Maid, Minister of Finance in Egypt. Welcome. We have Akim Steiner, UNDP Administrator. Alexia Latortu, who is the Assistant Secretary for International Development and Trade at US Treasury. We have Faith Ward here next to me, who's the CEO of Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. We have Ronald Beister, CEO of APG Asset Management and on the board of APG Group, so large Dutch pension provider and asset manager. And we have Kurt Morijsen, Head of ESG Advisory at Legal General Investment Management. So as you can see, we've got a brilliant group of public and private sector players who really are at the heart with their institutions of being able to unlock the type of funds that we need. Just to set the scene, you probably hear a whole load of numbers on what we need, but the UN have published a report saying 120 trillion needed over the next 3 decades just to transition across industries and geographies to net zero. And that about 70 to 80% of that needs to come from the private sector. Now those numbers that I just quoted don't include adaptation finance. Nick Stern put out a great report yesterday that had another set of numbers. And of the 120 trillion, we know about 50 to 60% of that needs to go to flow to emerging markets and developing markets, just again for the net zero transition. That's taking out adaptation, which is on top of that again. If we look at what's happening today, if we just take renewables, for example, we've had 2.8 trillion invested in renewables globally in the last 20 years, and only 2% of that went to Africa. So we're really not where we need to be. Let's be clear that we can't get to net zero and we can't get to a safe, resilient future without unleashing transition finance at this kind of scale over the next decade and then ramping up even more over the decades to come. So, His Excellency, I'll start with you, if you don't mind, as the host here. Egypt has a very successful track record with investors at the continental level, ranking first in the future.
Thank you very much for the introduction and this very important question. Let me say that Egypt has made a very good story with regard to energy and in particular renewables. This country 6 years ago used to have electricity only for 12 hours maximum a day, and the rest of the day you have no electricity in the whole of this country. 6 years ago we started the strategy, and the Ministry of Electricity published its energy strategy, which they started to implement it. This strategy is a combination of traditional way of generating energy to renewables. Over the 6 years, we were able to overcome significantly our energy shortage. To a country now is exporting energy. Is a country which has a surplus, and 20% of this energy generating is from renewables. We built the second or the third largest solar generating station in the world in the south of Egypt, in Bimban, which fully financed by private sector. Not only that, we started to be the leader in hydrogen, green hydrogen, green ammonia. And with the strategy we published it's moving very fast, which will enable Egypt, number one, to be a leader in green energy, and number two is to be an exporter of green energy to Europe. And with that, the country succeeded to diversify its sources of energy. We have stations generating electricity from wind, solar, from gas, from nuclear. We are building 4. So we have this diversification which enabled us. But let me say that relying heavily on the private sector to help Egypt to implement its energy strategy and to move gradually to replace the current ones with renewables, which we are moving. And yesterday we signed with Norwegian the hydrogen, which started the first stage of production in the economic Suez Canal area. It's something promising, which says that by 2030 we may be able to go to a higher percentage of energy based on renewables and green energy. So this is the story of the country of Egypt with regard to, let me say that without private sector, without the multilateral development banks and other countries, Germany, France, and others who supported us, and I believe this wasn't be possible because it's huge investment and still looking for more investment. As you've mentioned, Mwafi with the energy sector is taking the core at the projects which we are aiming, and yesterday we have seen signing of billions of dollars of project in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Minister. Alexia, if I may actually go over to you next in terms of talking about the kinds of projects that Dr. Mohammed spoke about, big, large-scale hydrogen infrastructure projects. They'll be very long-term. They'll be, quite expensive projects for commercial banks, the private sector to take on because of the cost of capital. So how do you actually crowd in that foreign capital? And I know that you've been doing a lot in Treasury in terms of, Secretary Yellen, yourself and others, in terms of what's the evolution of the MDBs so that we can move from a business model that's very much focused on the world where we need to unlock billions to a world where we need to unlock trillions with challenges like climate?
Thank you so much, Celine, for that question. It's something that is very important to me because we have to remember that the MDBs were created in a very different world where we were asking them to finance projects in one country and to focus on their own financing. And all of a sudden we're telling them, actually, given the enormity of the global challenges that we have, climate change being example number 1, really your own financing will never do the trick. And so you need to actually reorient what you do to not only finance projects yourself, but to be able to crowd in the private sector. And in our view, there is a 4-point evolution agenda that's really critical to that. The first one is for the MDBs to really socialize the fact that today their shareholders are asking them to absolutely keep doing work on poverty reduction, on achieving the SDGs, we still have a long way to go, and tackling global challenges like climate as an explicit part of their mandate and as a mutually reinforcing goal, these 3 things. So once the vision is clear, number 2, they need to think about the incentives for countries to come, countries like Egypt, to come to the development banks to borrow for global challenges like climate. And I want to stress that we're shifting from a world where the cost of a project and the benefits of the project accrue to the same project. If we're talking about tackling climate change, sometimes the cost is in a country, but the benefit will be for the region or for the world. And in those cases, it seems appropriate for the global community to help pay part of the cost. And so when we think about incentives for countries to borrow from the MDBs, we need to open up more concessionality, including for middle-income countries. Now caution, this is not the door super wide open, because it's not needed for all investments. So for example, solar now is quite competitive, cost competitive in many markets. But if you're trying to decommission coal, you'll need, deep concessionality. And so we need to develop, and the MDBs need to develop, a framework for thinking about concessionality for certain investments in the climate area. The third thing that we think is really important is looking at the operating model of the development banks to make them fit for purpose to address global challenges like climate. So, for example, we think they should be able to do more at the supranational level. They should be also able to do more at the sovereign level, including without a sovereign guarantee. The role of cities can be quite important in tackling some of the climate challenges. And then very importantly, and very directly to your question, Celine, is they need to sort of reorient their operating model to really understand that part of their mandate is to crowd in the private sector. And so we've talked a lot about blended finance all week. That is part of the equation, but I would think blended finance not just at the project level, but thinking about structures or platforms that could be regionally based or subject theme based. But we also need to develop more de-risking instruments. And I think we use guarantees already, but I think we could sort of think about more sophisticated types of guarantees. Insurance, reinsurance as well, really important. Bond issuances, for sure, is another place. And I know people don't always want to talk about this, but the policy piece is really critical too, right? Tackling the policy environment to unlock opportunities for the private sector. And then the fourth part of the MDB evolution agenda is the financing capacity. Because if we're going to do 1, 2, and 3, you said it in your opening, Celine, we need way more scale in the system. And so it means that the MDBs need to stretch their balance sheets to the maximum responsibly. Because we need scale today, but we need scale 5 years from now, and we need scale if, unfortunately, another shock happens. So this is an agenda that we and many of the shareholders have spoken particularly with the World Bank about. We started with the World Bank, we'll go out to all the developed banks, and we've asked them to come back to us with a clear roadmap of how they will address these 4 points, because this is not about talking, this is about changes, organizational changes, to get results in the near term for countries.
I mean, it's really good to hear that. I mean, I'm sitting here as a big global bank at HSBC, and we're doing exactly the same thing. We're redesigning our operating model so we can finance this stuff. So, the fact that the MDs need to go and do the same thing makes perfect sense. Akim, over to you, if I may, in terms of UNDP, jumping around a bit. When it comes to faith, I'll give you my microphone, that's easier. So UNDP, obviously, you do a lot of country programs, you do kind of funds, regional, private sector, you've got a goal around 1 trillion, I think, unlocking at the UNDP level. So maybe just tell me a bit about where you are on this journey.
Well, let me begin with the 1 trillion, because I think with the latest figures also that Lord Nicholas Stern and Vera Songway presented yesterday here, we're obviously sometimes at risk of projecting to the public out there that we are talking in a kind of Neverland realm of investments. But I think sometimes the danger when you aggregate is that you lose sight of the terrain in which you're actually moving. I mean, the fact of the matter is 1 to 2 trillion is roughly 1% to 2% of our current global wealth. I mean, we estimate global wealth at around 430 trillion. So if you put it in that context, first of all, the order of magnitude we are discussing here about redirecting or incentivizing to invest in problem solving for something that's existential becomes far less ominous as an absolute. Secondly, people think that this is all taxpayers' money. And I think we've already heard here that we are talking about a financial economy, about a global marketplace, a global economy, in which you're trying to essentially attract capital from investing. And that should be always remembered. A lot of this money is already being invested, but it's being invested in yesterday's technology, energy infrastructure, carbon-intensive infrastructure. It's not about printing more money, it's about redirecting, re-incentivizing this money. So, very quickly to pivot to UNDP, one reason why we have become so much more engaged in the issue of finance and financing of development and therefore of climate change is very simple. We work in 170 countries. The countries we serve are looking for partners who can, without necessarily being a lender to them, help them think through what their options are. Much of what we do today is to do the de-risking that enters into the domain policy that enables a country like Egypt to develop scenarios on how to mobilize capital investment for renewables, for transitions, for different forms of land use and agriculture production. and therefore make, if you want, downstream of where investors usually look at the global marketplace, a country much more interesting. It also brings down the cost of borrowing because risk is viewed differently. At the other end of the spectrum, we decided to invest in something that ESG was not really delivering in the market. That is a greater degree of transparency and accountability when it comes to impact. SDG impact, that's the term that we use in UNDP, is today a set of norms that we have developed very closely with many stakeholders, including the financial sector, that allows countries now to develop bond instruments with which to go to capital markets. And we have had remarkable uptake of this, over $7-8 billion just in the first 12 months in the development bank in Mexico and Uzbekistan, with Uruguay, with whom we've cooperated. And what we're trying to, in a sense, add here is the capacity of a development agency to speak more clearly to the accountability, transparency, and measurability of impact. Because, as we have also seen with the Secretary General, he just announced a report that is trying to counter also this fear of greenwashing that has entered much of the climate finance arena as well. So that, as a development agency, is sort of the spectrum in which we are trying to help create the conditions in which money that today is invested over here, carbon intensive, fossil fuel, large scale, centralized generating infrastructure, into decarbonized, decentralized, off-grid, or indeed regional integration of power grids that allow a transition to the kind of levels that you have spoken to, Minister, to happen in many more countries. And I think this is why we should not be scared of this notion of trillions, because trillions are already being transacted in our energy system every year. Thank you.
Thanks, Akio. I'm going to go over to more of a private sector view now, and I'm working out who to start with, and maybe Tracy, we've got the microphone now, so we'll start with you. So you're CEO of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate.
Chair. The chair. My CEO, the chair of the Institutional
Chair. Apologies, yeah, chair. And that group represents, is it now 50 trillion of assets under management? What's the latest? Probably growing number.
Yeah, I think about 62 trillion and over 375 members representing sort of like a European sort of asset body, including HSBC, Belgium and APG, all members. So our role is to accelerate that transition and to really enable those. And my day job is to be one of those investors as well. So I'm actually a sort of a capital allocator when I'm not representing IGCC at COP.
So as an organisation, we'll come to some of the individual kind of asset managers next. But what are the kind of systems changes that are that you're kind of putting with that collective in place now to try and unlock these trillions? And as part of that, obviously, naturally money tends to flow more easily to the north and the west and less easily to the south and east. And so as part of that, also the net zero commitments, is there any also focus on making sure we're unlocking capital to where it's most needed as well?
No, absolutely. I mean, we know, and you started in your sort of introductory remarks, I mean, the level of capital that's needed, we need to triple the amount just in renewables in the next 10 years, and we know that the amount of money going into emerging economies is a fifth of what it needs to be. So there's a massive gap there, and I suppose the way that we're sort of seeing this is, I suppose, to really leverage the points that have already been made. This is an investment opportunity, so I know we operate an investment in a very sort of risk-orientated way, but kind of pivot that to the investment opportunity set. So one of the ways in which IGCC aims to do that initiated the Net Zero Investor Framework, which is the most used framework for the investor community setting their net zero commitments, and that requires the setting of a climate solutions target as well as decarbonisation. And I would argue that actually almost that's more important, because the solutions is that flow of capital, particularly to developing economies that can really kind of sort of revolutionise and really accelerate that transition that we want to make. And investors are making it. Last year at COP, I made announcements where you had asset owners allocating up to 17% of their AUM to these kind of solution areas, but it's not enough, either speed or quantum. And some of that, there are policy constraints. We need governments that they can really help to kind of accelerate the speed of the deployment. One of the areas is the global investor statement to the governments on the climate crisis, which sets out some of the kind of asks that will really help in in terms of sort of setting not only the ambitious NDCs, but really integrating that into policy commitments so we can see the plans. One of the things I think that's made a real difference was some of the commitments we had around electric vehicles and the rollout of that, and then just the clarity around that sector decarbonisation pathway. And we need similar sort of transition plans for those sort of hard to abate sectors, and also regional pathways, as you say, country pathways. What is the what are the plans for the developing economies, and so we can get behind those and put that money to work. So this is really important, as you say, quite a massive gap. And that, I think the commitment, the passion to do that is there. It's just a case of sort of having that in a supportive policy environment.
Thanks very much, Dave. I think within HSBC we have an asset management arm, and I'm going to go over to Kurt next as an asset manager from LGIM. But I know that when we did the analysis, we estimated that about 50% of net flows for asset management are going to be linked to the transition by 2030. So it's just business, right? It's like you have to be in that market. Plus, obviously, that's an area that all the LPs want engagement around. So there's a huge amount of innovation happening in the sector to be able to fund this. So it'd be great to hear a bit from you, Kurt. Thanks a lot.
I'm checking here, yes. Thanks. It's a great question, but a lot of the things I'm hearing at the COP, and a lot of my comments resonates with Akin and Alexis, is about building an ecosystem for foreign investments. But how do we do that? I look at three things. The first one, the role of international organizations, public sector, in designing meaningful strategic policies, frameworks, regulatory reforms, to create a bedrock for business in countries. So technical assistance, blended finance is critical. You can have the best policy in a country, but if you don't have business aligned with the ESG factors, UN SDG factors, and we can say ESG as a risk mitigation tool, and in fact it is, or impactful business, we're just half of the way. I can have a great policies, but I also have to work in training and helping private sector, local private sector, and building their capabilities, ESG integration, impact integration. They are phenomenal business models in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and we could label them impact business. And the only reason I believe they are not part of it is because it's just missing a small component. Integrating those KPIs, measurability, adaptability, as Faith was saying. So if we build these two cornerstones, for the investment perspective, probably Ronald will be with me here, it is having innovative investment vehicles. I hear a lot at the COP, transition, but also adaptation, resilience, mitigation. Not all countries are in the process of transition. Others, we have to look at financing adaptation in infrastructure or resilience. This means that investment vehicles have to adapt to the needs of countries and vice versa. In this sense, in quick words, what we actually need in investment vehicles. I look at the urgency of impact investing guidelines or principles for bonds. A lot of the investment in infrastructure in emerging markets will deliver great value for climate. Equity is fine, businesses are fine, but there is a huge gap in infrastructure. When you look at the bond business, only 15% of the green bonds are issued for emerging markets. And of those, 60% are in China. Huge opportunity. I stop here just saying, emerging markets don't lack ideas, don't lack projects, innovation, they lack finance. And with a good investments and good investment vehicles, then we can allocate not only trillion, 1 trillion or 2 trillions, but with just business as usual. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. And This is still working, yeah? So last but not least, of course, so it'd be great to hear from you in terms of where you're thinking about this from a pension fund perspective.
Thank you. Is the mic? Yeah, the microphone is working. Yeah, thank you. I think that I could answer the question about what we could do in a defensive mode, but yes, I would like to talk about solutions, think about innovation, be forward-thinking and not defensive. But it is important to understand some context. The context of a pension fund investor is, of course, to be aware of a fiduciary duty, be aware of necessity to create good return in a moderate risk, responsible risk pattern, risk attitude way, and yes, to take into account sustainability. And that needs a less forward-looking approach, maybe, and that is the bad thing about it, because if you are return-oriented, and if you are looking for sustainability and you are looking for proof, you find a couple of blocking factors to invest in emerging markets, developing countries. And I think the way to remove those, and I agree, is all
I think you have to hold your mic a bit more up, as you're an earlier panel. This does the trick. Tip it up.
So I should hold my hand up higher, not the microphone. That solves the mystery. I was raising the microphone. It was the hand. Okay. So green bond issuance helps a lot, and actually you get access to many investors, and in a way it's an easy solution. So we very much would encourage it and recognize the importance of it. But we should not stop there, and we should try to work on removing the blocking factors. And to remove, I think, the big gap that is out there between private investors and development banks governance. And how can we do that? What are private investors looking for? Many things, and I think blocking factors that we could remove. One is it scalable? Are the investments scalable? And I think an easy solution is if you are able to combine many small investors, they become big. So if you are able to combine and put those in an investment structure, it becomes bigger. Flexibility is one thing. Can you as an investor sort of select the projects, the loans, the activities, the infrastructure that you want to invest in and have a certain influence? And I don't mean operational influence as such, but a way to determine whether something works or not. Do you have certain controls in place? And I think that can be solved in a way by putting in a strong operator in between. Then transparency. I think we need a certain amount of transparency. Sometimes things are a bit hidden, and of course we need to adhere to certain standards to be able to defend that we invest in something. Then liquidity. For an investor, liquidity, and we are long-term investors, and many of our asset owners, clients, our pension funds are long-term investors, but there need to be an end to an investment somewhere. It could be 30 years, a long period, but there needs to be an idea about an end to the investment. And risk sharing, I think that's an important way to share responsibility and to bridge the gap. If governments are able to come up with first loss assurance, or at least go invest, I think it is a lot easier to be able to go aside these government organizations or the government themselves in investments. We are trying to remove those 5 blocking factors. An example of that is the ILX platform that we have established. That is finding a way to bridge it. Our client, our pension fund client, ABP, has invested 750 million. That's not trillions, I admit, but it is a good start and a good contribution in private loan investments that are used, and the organization, the platform bridges the gap between us as asset owner investors and the projects out there that are handled by development banks and governments. And that's important that somebody bridges that.
Ronald, I'm going to come in here so we can get another round of questions in. We have about 10, 15 minutes. I know you've
But I thought, well, my microphone is working, I need to repair it.
Mine's probably going to
I hear you, thank you.
Good stuff. What I'm hoping to do on this next round is focus a little bit about barriers, but not just leave on a downer. Also, we've got great panelists. If you've got a barrier that is key barriers for you that someone on this panel you think can help with, and please direct your barrier or your solution or your ask to others on this panel as well. So maybe you have something to ask Alexia for, His Excellency, or the US Treasury might be. I wouldn't guess who has something to ask from others, but I would like to focus a bit on barriers here in terms of what we really need to overcome, especially in the next 6 months and the next year. So I will start maybe with you, Dr. Mohammed, if you wouldn't mind. You need a microphone, maybe not that one. Okay.
If I got your question right, the barriers for accessing finance or for...
Yeah, so barriers to unlock to get the scale of finance you need, and also there's anyone on this panel in their organizations that can help.
Okay, let us look at the figures which published everywhere that for us, in order to reach the SDGs by 2030, this world is annually in shortage of $3.7 trillion US dollars. Africa alone is $1.3 trillion. We found that only 5% of all the green financing or financing climate change is coming to Africa. With the current situation of no accessibility, high debt, high cost of financing, high inflation, and war, and all of that, all of these are barriers. Barriers for financing, barriers for moving with climate change, this one. Second one, as we were discussing this morning, we need more, let me say, putting the standards for, the standard for sustainability, standard for green financing. We're still, struggling with what we should do in order to be able to access green financing, whether green bond, whether green loans, whether private sector. We still need a lot of, upgrading skills, knowledge transfer, and building the capacity to be able to access successfully.
That are quite competitive now. We need to now figure out the hard to abate sectors: cement, aluminum, steel. We need technologies that are not yet invented to be able to facilitate the transition. That's why I'm really proud in the United States that we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to really give certainty and clarity to the private sector that they can make the large-scale investments needed to develop the technologies that we need to facilitate this transition.
Thanks very much. I think definitely the Inflation Reduction Act is the envy of the world right now. It's such a brilliant sea change in terms of the ability to now go in and invest in those new economy areas. Akim, over to you. And again, silver bullet is the wrong word because there is none, but what would you like to focus on from this side?
Very telegraphically where Alexia left off, obviously as the development branch of the United Nations, our focus will always be on ensuring that no one is left behind. So can we help those countries that will not be on the highway of international finance? Maybe the ones that are not in the group of 4 that you mentioned just now, or 6, how can we help them to at least have better terms of access to financing? I mean, it is a progression and it is one that we have to ensure, because otherwise we're going to leave. If you take the African continent, this is where 2 billion people will live. Just imagine for a moment an electricity generating infrastructure of the 1980s and 1990s being replicated on the African continent. This is more people coming onto the grid in Africa in the next 30 to 40 years than China has actually had to deal with it had to do electrification. So there is both a developmental rationale, there is also global climate change rationale to actually figuring that out. One example, if I just can build that, it's a reverse example. Many small savers can make up a big pot of money. What we also learn in Africa is it's very difficult to start having any commercially viable scheme when you sell individual photovoltaic panels to people who can't even afford to maybe pay for the education and school books of their children. So what you do, you aggregate essentially a business model, and it's being done in Africa already. Kenya and other countries are leading on that, where somebody actually invests in buying the panels, installs them, and has a pay-as-you-go charging system. Boom! You've brought the many small savers of a pension fund together. They are able to invest at a scale that is attractive. You've solved the problem that, poor people cannot invest in capital, but they do use a few cents a day to buy electricity so their children can actually study in the evening. And you've solved two problems at once, and you've created a market in which suddenly all these arguments that were used for 10, 15 years, why this will never work, are just gone. We need more creative business models, we need more smart regulatory frameworks, and suddenly markets open up, including for countries that traditionally, we know the financial world is very risk averse, is very often quite conservative, and will not touch with a barge pole. I mean, I'm using this deliberately as an argument. We can change that. And that is where the kind of panel that we have assembled here is precisely the sort of alliance that is needed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ekin. I might quickly hop to Ronald and then over to Faith and remind you the mic for you. You've got one, Ronald. Okay, perfect. So yeah, for Ronald next. So that you can finish where we are in terms of the either one, I think. Either one of you, the private sector view, maybe something innovative that you're looking for, or you see the peer group doing that is that is trying to shift this now in terms of shifting your own business model to scale up more in this space.
I'll be short here. I would like to underline the point that yes, we are open, and the political will, the point that Alexia made, needs to be there. And that's not only true for developing countries, it's also true, I think, for developed countries that often governments don't like to see private investment there because they ask for certain things. And I realize you want to have control of your own infrastructure, control of certain things that you want to do, but there's many ways to solve that. And I think sometimes we also see the political will missing it, and we can talk a lot, but then it's not going to happen. So that's the only thing I would like to
add one thing. There is an interesting quote, African proverb that said, you can walk fast alone, but you can walk further together. What Akin is saying is fantastic. We're speaking the same language. There would be no one investor or two or one country or one DFI, one MDB or UNDP or UNCDF alone that could solve this issue. There is a universe to invest. It's much more the convenient power, the catalytic power of the UN is critical. And that's an example we have here today. We have the UN Treasury, amazing association of the IGCCC, an asset owner, a massive asset manager of almost $2 trillion, and we're together because of the UN. So that's the real power. And of course, the Egyptian government.
And on that note, I'll let Faith wrap up a little bit from a systems perspective with the IGCCC.
No, thank you. And I think I'll just build really, and I totally agree with all of those points. I think we just all need to be courageous, all in our own areas, but I think some of that courage can be built by continuing this communication and just keep talking to each other, because we do sometimes talk past each other, and I think we just need, and then we just make so much progress, I think, by having those conversations, and those reinforced by having, as you say, those depth of plans. We need to have that sort of that granularity, so we can really, we can get behind. So I think there is that spirit that we want to be investing this money, we want to accelerate that transition, and it is about that cooperation and being courageous together, and to continue to do that, and not wait till COP28 to have another one of these conversations. Let's just keep that dialogue going every week. We just got to keep it going. So communicate, collaborate. I think good words.
Thanks, Faith. You've done a brilliant job of helping wrap up for me. I think that the main thing is we have to do things structurally differently now moving forwards. We have to work together, and we need some structural changes, structural reforms of the MDBs, of the way DFIs work, of the big commercial banks. We have to redesign ourselves. We have to look at our own risk appetite for this. We have to look out carve-outs of balance sheet. We have to engage with the prudential regulators on capital treatment so we can do more of this stuff at scale. We have to be working, with our Egyptian colleagues on looking at the investment pipeline, what we can invest in, how we can bring in the DFIs, how we can work with the UN and others on the pipeline, how we can work with our asset management colleagues to invest in. So it's one ecosystem. Finance is an ecosystem. And we need some structural changes, but there's a brilliant opportunity here. I think we know what we need to do. We need to get on with it. So thank you very much, panelists, and thanks for everyone for joining.